On the morning of June 4, 1942, as the sun climbed higher over the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga stood aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, his hands still unsteady from the adrenaline of combat. The flight roster he clutched represented more than just a list of aircraft and pilots. It was a record of the bombing mission over Midway Atoll that had just concluded, and as he looked through the bridge windows at the controlled pandemonium unfolding on the flight deck below, he had no way of knowing that he was standing at the precipice of one of history's most decisive moments. The scene on the deck was one of organized urgency. Type 99 dive bombers were being moved aside with practiced efficiency, while Type 97 torpedo planes underwent a critical transformation as their torpedoes were being replaced with 800-kilogram bombs. Fuel hoses lay across the deck like a network of steel serpents, creating a complex web that the deck crews navigated with the ease of long experience. In Tomonaga's pocket, an unfinished letter to his wife awaited completion. The last line he had written read with confident simplicity, "The Americans are nowhere to be found." Victory is certain. He could not have known, standing there at 10:22 in the morning, that American aircraft were already converging on his exact position. He could not have predicted that the next 11 minutes would determine not merely the fate of 4 Japanese carriers under his feet, but would fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. He could not have imagined that every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy held about carrier warfare, about American capabilities, about their own seeming invincibility, was about to be obliterated in the time it would take to drink a leisurely cup of tea. Below him on the flight deck, aircraft mechanic Petty Officer First Class Kaname Harada supervised the weapons changeover that Admiral Nagumo had ordered mere minutes earlier. The work proceeded with desperate efficiency born of countless drills. They had trained extensively for exactly this scenario, switching from land attack ordnance to ship attack weapons, but never had they performed this complex operation under such intense pressure. Never with scouts radiating back conflicting intelligence reports, never with the strange, almost indefinable sensation that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong, despite all the concrete evidence suggesting Japanese superiority and dominance. At 10:20 in the morning, the Japanese carriers had stood as undisputed masters of the Pacific, their aircraft being meticulously prepared to destroy what intelligence suggested was a lone American carrier somewhere in the area. By 10:31, just 11 minutes later, 3 of the 4 carriers would be mortally wounded, transformed in the blink of an eye into burning steel coffins by American dive bombers that seemed to have materialized from empty sky. Those 11 minutes would reveal fundamental truths about modern naval warfare that neither navy had fully understood until they unfolded in real time across the Pacific's endless blue canvas. The mathematical superiority of Japanese naval power on that morning seemed absolutely unassailable. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, which represented the most powerful carrier striking force that had ever been assembled in the history of naval warfare. 4 fleet carriers sailed under his command: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships carried 248 aircraft, and manning those aircraft were the most experienced naval aviators anywhere in the world. These were veterans who had participated in Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, the attacks on Darwin and Ceylon. These were men who had sunk more Allied warships in a mere 6 months than the Imperial Navy had managed to destroy in all of its previous wars combined, going back decades. Opposing them, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned 3 carriers in carefully chosen waters. Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown formed his strike force. Yorktown deserved particular mention because she had been so heavily damaged in recent combat that repairs should have required 3 full months in a proper shipyard. Instead, through an almost superhuman effort, 1,400 workers at Pearl Harbor had rendered her barely seaworthy in just 72 hours. The Americans fielded 233 aircraft, and the vast majority were flown by pilots who had never experienced actual combat. Many had logged fewer than 300 total flight hours. The torpedo bomber squadrons were particularly ill-equipped, flying the TBD Devastator, an aircraft so obsolete and vulnerable that the pilots themselves had grimly nicknamed it the TB Dead. Captain Taijiro Aoki of the Akagi had been supremely confident, writing in his personal war diary, "The American Navy is a broken force." After today, they will have no carriers in the Pacific. The war will effectively be over. This wasn't mere swagger or empty boasting. The Japanese had achieved victory in every carrier engagement of the war thus far. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, which had occurred just 1 month earlier and marked the first carrier versus carrier battle in the history of warfare, they had sent the USS Lexington, America's second-largest carrier, to the bottom of the ocean while losing only the light carrier Shoho. They had raided Darwin with complete impunity, struck Ceylon without facing organized opposition, and operated with remarkable freedom from Hawaii all the way to the Indian Ocean. What the Japanese commanders didn't know on that particular morning could have filled multiple volumes. They remained unaware that American cryptanalysts working at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had successfully broken their JN-25 naval code. They had no idea that Admiral Nimitz had essentially read their operation orders, that he knew their target was Midway, that he understood the composition of their force, and that he had positioned his carriers in waters where they could achieve tactical surprise. They didn't know that virtually every fundamental assumption they had made was incorrect, but this lack of knowledge wouldn't become apparent until the bombs were actually falling from the sky. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had meticulously planned the Pearl Harbor attack, lay seriously ill with pneumonia in his cabin aboard the Akagi. His absence from the bridge during the critical hours would prove more significant than anyone could have anticipated. He alone among the Japanese commanders had consistently advocated for maintaining a permanent reserve of aircraft armed specifically for anti-ship operations. His substitute, Commander Tamotsu Oishi, lacked both Genda's remarkable intuition and his almost paranoid concern about the possibility of American carriers appearing unexpectedly. The Japanese also operated under the assumption that Yorktown remained out of action. Their naval intelligence had confirmed she had sustained heavy damage at Coral Sea, which was absolutely true. They had calculated that repairs would require a minimum of 3 months, which would have been accurate for any Japanese shipyard operating under normal circumstances. What they couldn't conceive was that American workers at Pearl Harbor had compressed 3 months of repairs into 3 days, that welders had worked continuously even while the ship was actually underway, that her elevators had been repaired while she sailed toward Midway. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo had launched 7 scout planes to search for American ships. This launch represented a compromise that would prove fateful. Standard doctrine called for dozens of scouts to ensure comprehensive coverage, but Nagumo wanted to preserve his aircraft for the strike on Midway. Each scout would fly a single line outward for 300 miles and then return, leaving vast expanses of ocean completely unsearched. The most critical search line, designated number 4 from the cruiser Tone, launched 30 minutes late because of catapult mechanical problems. This single mechanical failure would place Tone's scout plane over the American fleet at precisely the worst possible moment for the Japanese, when their decks were crowded with aircraft in the process of being rearmed and refueled. Petty Officer First Class Amari, a scout plane observer from the battleship Haruna, would later provide testimony explaining their mindset. "We flew our assigned line, seeing nothing but empty ocean. We were trained to see what we expected. Merchant ships, perhaps a cruiser. Nobody was actively looking for American carriers because nobody genuinely believed American carriers were anywhere in the vicinity." At 4:30 in the morning, while darkness still covered the ocean, 108 Japanese aircraft had launched for the strike on Midway. The force consisted of 36 Zero fighters, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Kate torpedo bombers, though the torpedo bombers carried bombs instead of torpedoes for the land attack mission. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike formation. his aircraft equipped with a radio that would soon transmit the message that would trigger the chain of fatal decisions. The Midway strike force encountered resistance far fiercer than anticipated. American fighters, though consisting of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, were waiting at altitude, having been warned by radar. Anti-aircraft fire proved intense and accurate. The Japanese lost 11 aircraft with 14 more sustaining heavy damage. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, Tomonaga transmitted a message at 7 in the morning. There is need for a second attack wave. This message arrived just as Admiral Nagumo faced the most crucial decision of his entire career. He had maintained 93 aircraft in reserve, torpedo planes armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs specifically for ship attack. American B-17s from Midway were conducting bombing runs on his fleet from high altitude, ineffectively but forcing constant evasive maneuvers. Torpedo bombers from Midway had just completed their attack, also ineffectively, but demonstrating that Midway retained offensive capability that needed to be suppressed. Commander Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu argued strenuously for maintaining the anti-ship armament. "Sir, we should keep the reserve armed for ship attack. We have heard nothing from our scouts, but that doesn't mean there are no American ships in the area." But Nagumo, under mounting pressure from the continuing attacks and influenced by Tomonaga's urgent message, made his fateful decision at 7:15 in the morning. Remove torpedoes. Load bombs for land attack. What followed was controlled chaos that would ultimately prove fatal. Each Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber carried either one Type 91 torpedo or one 800-kilogram land attack bomb. Switching between them required an elaborate process, rolling the aircraft to the hangar deck via elevator, removing the torpedo using special carriages, mounting the bomb using different attachment points, adjusting the release mechanism to account for different ballistics, returning the aircraft to the flight deck, and refueling for a different mission profile that required different fuel loads. Aviation Ordnance Man, Second Class. Takeshi Maeda, serving on the Kaga, would later describe the frantic scene. "We worked like demons possessed. Torpedoes were being stacked on the hangar deck because returning them to the magazine took far too long. Fuel hoses were everywhere, creating a maze across the deck. We were refueling aircraft simultaneously with changing weapons, something that was strictly forbidden in peacetime but necessary to save precious time. The hangar deck became essentially a bomb with a lit fuse. But we didn't think about the danger in those moments. We had performed this drill hundreds of times in training." On the Akagi, the situation proved even more complex. The ship carried Type 99 dive bombers that could carry either 250-kilogram general-purpose bombs or 242-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bombs. The latter were specifically designed for ships, the former for land targets. Crews had to not only physically change bombs, but change bomb types entirely, each requiring different fuses and mounting brackets that had to be precisely installed. At 7:28 in the morning, as the frantic rearming operation continued across all four carriers, Tone's delayed scout plane finally reached its designated turn point. Pilot Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari was preparing to turn back toward the fleet when he spotted white wakes on the distant horizon. His radioed report was frustratingly vague. "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo received this transmission at 7:40 in the morning. 10 ships could mean virtually anything. Destroyers, transports, cruisers, nothing that necessarily required the urgent attention of his carrier force. He continued the rearming operation for land attack while simultaneously ordering the scout to ascertain ship types and maintain contact with the enemy formation. At 7:55, Nagumo received a follow-up message that would later haunt him in his memories. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Relief flooded through the bridge of the Akagi. Cruisers and destroyers, but no carriers. The rearming could continue without interruption. Some officers even celebrated quietly, because catching an American surface force without air cover would provide excellent hunting and easy kills. But at 8:09 in the morning, another message arrived, this one correcting the previous report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one carrier bringing up the rear. The bridge of the Akagi erupted in controlled panic. A carrier, even a single carrier, fundamentally changed everything about the tactical situation. Within seconds, Nagumo issued new orders. Suspend rearming. Leave torpedoes on aircraft that still have them. Prepare to launch ship attack immediately. But the situation below decks had already passed the point where it could be quickly reversed. Half the aircraft had bombs physically attached but not yet fused for combat use. Others had torpedoes partially mounted but not secured. Some aircraft sat on the flight deck with bombs, while others remained in the hangar with torpedoes. To launch a properly coordinated strike, all aircraft needed to be armed with the same type of weapon. They required at least 45 minutes to either complete the bomb conversion or fully return to torpedo armament. The situation was actually considerably worse than anyone on the bridge fully understood. The returning Midway strike force was now approaching the carriers, running low on fuel, many aircraft damaged, all needing to land immediately. Imperial Navy doctrine was absolutely clear and inflexible on this point. You recovered your aircraft first, then launched new strikes afterward. To do otherwise would mean losing dozens of aircraft, and more critically, their veteran pilots whose training had taken years and who could not be quickly replaced. At 8:30 in the morning, Nagumo made his second fatal decision. Recover the Midway strike force first, then we will deal with the American carrier. From 8:37 until 9:17, all 4 Japanese carriers focused exclusively on recovering the Midway strike force. This operation, even under ideal circumstances with undamaged aircraft, was inherently complex. The process required clearing the flight deck of spotted aircraft, turning the ship into the wind, recovering aircraft in proper sequence with damaged aircraft landing first, then fighters with lowest fuel, then bombers, striking aircraft below to the hangar immediately to clear deck space for subsequent landings, refueling and rearming recovered aircraft, and finally spotting new aircraft on deck for the next launch. What the Japanese commanders didn't know, couldn't have known, was that time had already run out for them. At 7:02 in the morning, Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise had made what would prove to be the most important decision of his career. He had ordered, "Launch everything immediately, at maximum range, without waiting to coordinate a proper strike package." His air operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had protested the order. "Admiral, we'll be launching at extreme range. Many planes won't make it back to the carriers." Spruance's reply would prove prophetic. "We may lose planes, but if we catch them recovering their Midway strike, we'll catch them at their most vulnerable moment." The American carrier launch, conducted between 7:02 and 8 o'clock in the morning, was barely controlled chaos that would have appalled any Japanese naval aviation instructor. Instead of a properly coordinated strike package with fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers arriving simultaneously from multiple directions, each squadron launched as soon as it was ready and proceeded independently toward the target area. From Enterprise, 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers organized in 2 squadrons, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Hornet, 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Yorktown, launching approximately 2 hours later than the others, 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch was a disaster by Japanese standards of coordination and precision. Squadrons became separated during the flight to target. Fighters flew at different altitudes from the bombers they were supposed to protect. Radio discipline collapsed as pilots tried to locate each other. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons in completely wrong directions. Hornets fighters and dive bombers never found the Japanese fleet at all, eventually running out of fuel and either ditching in the ocean or returning to base with their weapons still loaded. Ensign George Gay, a torpedo bomber pilot from Hornet's VT-8 squadron, would later describe the grim reality they faced. "We launched knowing we probably wouldn't make it back to the carrier. Our squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Waldron, told us straight out, 'We're going alone, we'll probably all be killed, but we're going to hit those carriers.' We flew off separately from our fighters and dive bombers. It was suicide, but it was also our job, and we were going to do it. At 9:18 in the morning, just as the last Japanese aircraft from the Midway strike successfully landed, radar equipment on the Soryu detected incoming aircraft approaching low on the water. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's VT-8 squadron, consisting of 15 obsolete torpedo bombers without any fighter escort, had found the Japanese fleet through a combination of brilliant navigation and sheer determination. The massacre that followed was complete and horrific. All 15 TBD Devastators were shot down. 29 of 30 aircrew were killed. Only Ensign Gay survived, managing to hide under his seat cushion floating in the water, from where he would witness what came next. Not a single torpedo hit any Japanese ship. The attack appeared completely futile. But the sacrifice, though seemingly futile in the moment, had actually achieved something crucial that would only become apparent in retrospect. The Zero fighters had all descended to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had been forced into violent evasive maneuvers, making it impossible to spot aircraft for launch. Most critically, the attention of every Japanese fighter pilot, every ship's lookout, every anti-aircraft gunner was focused downward at the water, not upward at the sky. At 9:36 in the morning, VT-6 from Enterprise arrived on the scene. 14 more torpedo bombers, also without proper escort, pressed home their attack. They too were massacred, losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a single hit. At 10 o'clock, Yorktown's VT-3 squadron arrived. 12 more torpedo bombers, with just a handful of fighters protecting them, attacked. They lost 10 of 12 aircraft, once again scoring no hits. By 10:20 in the morning, the last of the American torpedo bombers had either been destroyed or was fleeing the scene. The Japanese carriers began the process of recovering their Zeros, which were now running dangerously low on ammunition and fuel from the extended combat and multiple attack waves. Victory seemed absolutely complete. Not a single American torpedo had found its target, and 35 of 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed. The slaughter had been comprehensive. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally relaxed his tense posture. His operations officer reported with evident satisfaction, "Sir, we can be ready to launch our strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes, all aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs." The flight decks of all 4 carriers were now packed with aircraft in final preparation. The Akagi had 40 aircraft spotted on deck, fully fueled and armed. The Kaga had 30 aircraft ready. The Soryu had 33. The Hiryu, steaming further north in the formation, had 38. Fuel hoses remained connected to aircraft as final fuel loads were topped off. Ordnance crews were making final adjustments to bomb and torpedo mountings. Pilots sat in their cockpits, engines warming up, preparing for launch. Everything was ready. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had been flying in increasingly desperate circles, searching for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where it was supposed to be according to their pre-launch briefing. Running dangerously low on fuel, McCluskey had made an intuitive guess based on his experience. He decided to follow a Japanese destroyer he spotted racing northeast at high speed. That guess, that single decision based on instinct rather than orders, led him directly over the Japanese carriers at their single most vulnerable moment. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey's 33 dive bombers pushed over into their attack dives from 14,500 feet altitude. The Zero fighters were all at sea level, most actually landing or refueling. The anti-aircraft guns remained trained horizontally for torpedo defense. The decks were completely covered with aircraft, fuel hoses and ordnance. It was the perfect storm of vulnerability. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected the Akagi as his primary target. His bomb, along with others from his squadron, struck the carrier with devastating accuracy. On the Akagi, the 2 torpedoes and numerous bombs that had been removed from aircraft and stacked against all safety regulations directly in the hangar bay began detonating in a catastrophic chain reaction. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove on the Kaga. 4 bombs struck the massive carrier in fewer than 30 seconds. The first bomb hit forward of the island, destroying the bridge and killing Captain Jisaku Okada, along with his entire command staff, instantly. The subsequent bombs hit among the tightly packed aircraft on the deck. The induced explosions were absolutely catastrophic. The 800 kilograms of fuel, torpedoes and bombs aboard Kaga began exploding in rapid sequence. Within minutes, the ship had become an inferno from stem to stern. The heat generated was so intense that firefighting crews couldn't approach within 50 feet of the flames. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost exactly the same moment, targeting the Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck the carrier in an almost perfect line down the centre of the flight deck. The first bomb exploded in the forward hangar bay. The second hit amidships directly among packed aircraft being prepared for launch. The third destroyed the rear elevator, sending it crashing down into the hangar deck below. The Soryu had a particular vulnerability that proved fatal. She carried extra aviation fuel stored in auxiliary tanks along the hangar deck sides to extend her aircraft operational range. These tanks ruptured immediately from the explosions, creating a firestorm that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Men caught in the hangar bay had no chance of survival. At 10:31 in the morning, as suddenly as it had begun, the American attack was over. McCluskey's dive bombers were heading back toward their carriers, many aircraft running on fuel fumes, pilots uncertain if they would make it home. In just 11 minutes of actual combat, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat into burning, sinking hulks. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in visible shock on the bridge as massive explosions continued to rock the ship beneath his feet. His operations officer, Commander Oishi, was shouting damage reports that seemed impossible to believe. Flight deck destroyed. Hangar deck in flames. All aircraft lost. Steering control lost. Communications destroyed. Captain Taijiro Aoki physically grabbed Nagumo, who seemed paralyzed by the sudden reversal of fortune. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag to another ship. The Akagi is lost. We must abandon her." On the Kaga, the situation was even more catastrophic. With the captain and all senior officers killed in the very first bomb hit, command had devolved to the damage control officer, who was himself trapped below deck, surrounded by fire. The ship descended into chaos without clear leadership. The Soryu was dying fastest of the 3 stricken carriers. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his bridge even as flames approached his position. His final order, heard and confirmed by several survivors who made it off the ship, was simple. "Save yourselves. I will remain with Soryu." He was last seen by the final men to leave the bridge, lashing himself to the ship's helm, determined to go down with his command. In the minutes immediately following 10:31, the Japanese Navy faced a crisis beyond anything in their planning, their training, or their historical experience. 3/4 of their carrier striking power had been eliminated in less time than it took to conduct a single routine landing operation. On the Hiryu, the only surviving carrier in the strike force, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched in absolute horror as massive smoke columns rose on the horizon from his 3 sister ships. The mathematics of the disaster were devastating and immediately apparent. In 11 minutes of combat, the Japanese had lost 3 fleet carriers, approximately 110 aircraft that had been spotted on deck, 40-plus aircraft that had been in the hangar bays, 50-plus aircraft that were aloft with nowhere to land now that their carriers were destroyed, and would eventually lose over 2,000 skilled aircrew and maintenance personnel whose training represented years of investment. The scene aboard the burning carriers defied adequate description. On the Akagi, induced explosions continued for hours. Each massive explosion sent sheets of steel flying like enormous scythes through compartments packed with trapped men. The hangar deck had become essentially a crematorium. On the Kaga, the ship's massive size, as she had been converted from a battleship hull, meant more compartments and more trapped men. The fires above made rescue completely impossible. The steel bulkheads became so hot they glowed visibly red. Hundreds of men died trapped in sealed steel compartments. The Soryu's chief engineer, Commander Kondo, survived to later describe the engine room catastrophe. The first bomb severed the main steam lines. Superheated steam at 400 degrees filled the engineering compartments almost instantly. Men were literally steamed alive in seconds, others suffocated as the fires consumed all available oxygen. The screaming lasted only moments, but I'll hear it until I die. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiryu faced an impossible tactical situation with characteristic Japanese aggression. Despite having only one carrier against 3 American carriers, he immediately ordered a counterstrike without hesitation. At 10:58 in the morning, just 27 minutes after the devastating American attack, Hiryu launched 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The strike force found Yorktown at noon precisely. Despite facing prepared defences and radar-directed fighter interception, the veteran Japanese pilots pressed home their attack with characteristic determination. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, starting serious fires and damaging her boilers. The American carrier slowed to a complete stop, dead in the water. Yamaguchi immediately ordered a second strike without waiting to assess the full damage from the first. At 1:31 in the afternoon, 10 Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros launched from Hiryu. This tiny force found Yorktown again at 2:42 in the afternoon. Despite facing intense anti-aircraft fire that destroyed half the attacking aircraft, they succeeded in putting 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning Midway strike, led this final desperate attack. His aircraft had been damaged over Midway earlier that morning, its left-wing fuel tank holed by anti-aircraft fire. He knew with absolute certainty that he didn't have enough fuel to return to the carrier, but he launched anyway without hesitation. His torpedo was one of the 2 that struck home. His aircraft crashed into the sea immediately after the attack, having run completely out of fuel. At 5:03 in the afternoon, the inevitable occurred. 24 American dive bombers from Enterprise and the damaged Yorktown found the Hiryu. 4 bombs struck the last Japanese carrier, turning her into yet another inferno. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu, mortally wounded in the attack, gave his final order. "Scuttle the ship. Save the crew. Save as many as possible." Admiral Yamaguchi chose to remain aboard his dying flagship. His final message to his staff was simple and direct. "I will apologize to the Emperor for this defeat. You will rebuild the Navy and continue the war." As the Japanese carriers burned through the night, the surviving officers began to understand the full magnitude of their intelligence failure. The evidence, once they had time to reflect, was overwhelming in retrospect. American carriers positioned at precisely the right location to achieve tactical surprise. Midway fully alerted and prepared for the attack. Submarines positioned along Japanese approach routes. Strike aircraft launched at maximum range at exactly the right time to catch the carriers most vulnerable. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, operations officer of the combined fleet, would later write in his memoirs, "We realized that the Americans had read our mail. Every message, every order, every plan had been compromised. We had been performing for an audience that knew the entire script in advance. The surprise we thought we possessed had actually belonged entirely to them. We had walked into a carefully prepared ambush while believing we held the advantage." Beyond the intelligence failure, the battle revealed fundamental truths about carrier warfare that the Japanese had not fully understood despite their experience. Their entire doctrine of massed carrier operations, coordinated strikes, and holding reserves had been theoretically correct, but they had failed to execute it properly under the pressure of actual combat conditions. The American dive bomber, the SBD Dauntless, had proved superior to the vaunted Japanese Val in the only metric that ultimately mattered: survivability while delivering ordnance against heavily defended targets. The American doctrine of deck-load strikes rather than hangar storage meant they could launch faster in crisis situations. The American damage control procedures, which the Japanese had openly mocked as overcautious and indicative of weak ship design, had already saved Yorktown once at Coral Sea and would save numerous other carriers throughout the remaining war. As night fell on June 4th, thousands of Japanese sailors were in the water or crowded aboard destroyers that had picked them up. The three carriers were technically still afloat but burning, abandoned hulks visible on the horizon. Many Japanese sailors refused rescue, believing they had failed the Emperor and didn't deserve to live. Men would actively swim away from rescue lines, shouting, "May the Emperor live 10,000 years," and then deliberately dive under the surface, holding their breath until they drowned. What the Japanese didn't know in those dark hours was that the Americans believed they were losing even as they were winning. Admiral Spruance, receiving damage reports on his missing squadrons, calculated that he had lost over half his aircraft in the attacks. Yorktown was crippled and listing heavily. Japanese submarines were being reported throughout the area. Spruance's decision to continue the engagement despite this uncertainty would prove crucial to achieving complete victory. His scouts found the burning Japanese carriers that evening, confirming the magnitude of what had been accomplished. But even then, the Americans didn't fully understand what they had achieved in those 11 minutes. June 5th brought cruel confirmation of both American fears and Japanese disaster. The submarine I-168, specifically dispatched by Admiral Yamamoto to hunt for damaged American carriers, found Yorktown under tow, barely making headway. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe maneuvered into position and fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown directly, while 1 hit the destroyer Hammond that was alongside providing assistance. Yorktown would eventually sink on June 7th, becoming the last carrier lost at Midway. But by then, the final outcome was already decided beyond any doubt. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone, scuttled by their own destroyers when it became absolutely clear they couldn't be saved. The human cost of those 11 minutes continued to mount for days after the battle. The Akagi was scuttled at 5 in the morning on June 5th, after burning continuously for 19 hours. The Kaga sank at 7:25 in the evening on June 4th, taking 811 men with her. The Soryu went under at 7:13 in the evening on June 4th, with 711 souls trapped aboard. The Hiryu lingered until 9 in the morning on June 5th, before finally disappearing beneath the waves. The total Japanese death toll from the 4 carriers reached 2,181 men. But these weren't just ordinary sailors or easily replaced personnel. They represented the experienced mechanics who could service complex aircraft engines in the field, the skilled armourers who could mount torpedoes in minutes under combat conditions, the fuel handlers who could conduct dangerous underway replenishment operations, the veteran pilots who had conquered half the Pacific and whose training had taken years to complete. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the massive battleship Yamato positioned 300 miles behind the carrier force, received the catastrophic reports in complete silence. His staff officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, described the scene aboard the flagship. The admiral sat completely still, not moving at all, for nearly an hour after learning of the 4th carrier's loss. Then he said quietly, as if speaking to himself, "The war is over. We will fight on because we must, but the war is fundamentally over." Yamamoto understood immediately what others would take months or even years to fully grasp. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet and light carriers representing decades of investment and development. In just 6 months of war, they had already lost 5 carriers. They could certainly build new carriers, and they would make every effort to do so, but they couldn't possibly replace the trained crews at anything approaching the rate of loss. A fully qualified carrier pilot required approximately 2 years of intensive training. A qualified aircraft mechanic needed 18 months of specialized instruction. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of intensive drilling just to operate efficiently and safely. The mathematics were absolutely inexorable and favored America completely. By the time Japan managed to commission 1 replacement carrier, America would have launched 17 new carriers. American pilot training programs were producing 10,000 qualified pilots per month by 1943. Japan never exceeded 500 pilots per month and couldn't even replace their combat losses at that reduced rate. The survivors of Midway carried deep psychological scars that affected the entire Japanese Navy for the remainder of the war. The myth of Japanese invincibility was comprehensively shattered. The supreme confidence that had driven operations from Pearl Harbor through the Indian Ocean to Ceylon evaporated completely in those 11 minutes of dive bomber attacks. The Japanese Navy instituted numerous new procedures based on Midway's bitter lessons. Combat air patrol would always retain fighters at altitude. Decks would be kept clear of aircraft unless immediately launching. Ordnance would be returned to magazines immediately after being removed from aircraft. Multiple search patterns would overlap to prevent gaps in coverage. Radio silence would be abandoned in favor of tactical communication when threats were detected. But these procedural changes came too late to affect the war's outcome, and they addressed the symptoms rather than the fundamental cause. The fundamental cause was that American intelligence capabilities, industrial production capacity, and technological innovation had already surpassed Japan's capabilities, and the gap would only widen as the war progressed. For the Americans, those 11 minutes created a fundamentally different psychological transformation, converting them from desperate defenders into confident aggressors. The Pacific Fleet, traumatized and humiliated by Pearl Harbor, had discovered it could not just fight the Japanese Navy on equal terms, but could actually destroy it decisively. Admiral Nimitz, receiving full confirmation of the victory, told his assembled staff, "They are not supermen. They can be beaten. They have been beaten decisively. Now we take the offensive and carry the war to them." The tactical lessons learned were immediately incorporated into American doctrine. Dive bombers were recognized as the supreme ship killers. Coordinated strikes were ideal, but not absolutely essential for victory. First strike advantage was almost always decisive in carrier warfare. Radar-directed fighter control was crucial for defense. Comprehensive damage control procedures could save seemingly doomed ships. But perhaps the most important lesson was purely psychological. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Hornet's VT-8 squadron, who had floated in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn, expressed it with direct simplicity. "We had stood up to the absolute best they had, and we destroyed it comprehensively. After witnessing that, we knew with certainty that we would win this war. It was just a matter of time and blood." Post-war analysis conducted by both nations revealed the precise sequence of those 11 minutes in devastating detail. The Japanese carriers had been caught in what naval theorists now call the vulnerable window, that critical moment when a carrier is essentially helpless. Aircraft being actively serviced on deck, preventing any defensive maneuvers. Fuel lines physically connected to aircraft, making catastrophic fire inevitable. Ordnance exposed and unstowed, multiplying the effect of any damage. Attention focused entirely elsewhere, preventing early detection of the threat. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the brilliant intelligence officer whose codebreakers had made the entire ambush possible, observed with characteristic modesty, "We won Midway because we knew exactly when they would be most vulnerable, and we were extraordinarily lucky to catch them at precisely that moment. 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, and the battle could easily have ended very differently." Today, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers lie in Midway's deep waters, designated as war graves for the thousands who died. Renowned oceanographer Robert Ballard's expeditions have located Yorktown at 16,650 feet and Kaga at 17,700 feet, their broken hulls serving as permanent testimonies to those 11 minutes. Recent expeditions conducted in 2023 have provided detailed photographic surveys of these wrecks, which are now protected within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. Survivors from both nations established memorials and conducted regular commemorations where former enemies met as friends, united in recognition of a battle that fundamentally changed history. The Japanese Navy's desperate attempt to hide Midway's catastrophic outcome from its own population, quarantining survivors and swearing them to absolute secrecy while claiming victory in public announcements even as they hid the devastating defeat, corroded morale throughout the entire fleet and established a pattern of institutional deception that would continue until the war's bitter end. Historians have engaged in endless debate about how different those 11 minutes might have been under altered circumstances. If Tone's Scout had launched exactly on schedule, though paradoxically, modern research actually demonstrates that the mechanical delay helped the Japanese discover the Americans earlier than they would have otherwise. If Nagumo had maintained a properly armed reserve strike force. If the American torpedo bombers hadn't attacked when they did and drawn the Japanese fighters down to sea level. If McCluskey hadn't made the intuitive decision to follow that lone destroyer racing northeast. But history operates in only one timeline and offers no alternatives. What actually happened in those 11 minutes changed absolutely everything that followed. Modern military strategists throughout the world still intensively study Midway for lessons directly applicable to contemporary conflict. Information dominance remains absolutely decisive in modern warfare. First strike advantage in high-technology warfare almost always determines final outcomes. All military systems, no matter how sophisticated, have identifiable moments of maximum vulnerability. Individual decisions made under extreme pressure still determine outcomes despite advanced technology. Superior systems will defeat superior warriors when the two come into direct conflict. In letters, personal diaries, and extensive interviews collected over 8 decades, survivors painted intimate portraits of those 11 minutes from multiple perspectives. American and Japanese accounts converge on certain universal truths: the overwhelming chaos, the incredible individual heroism displayed by men on both sides, the absolute terror of combat, and the complete transformation that occurred in those decisive moments. The United States Naval War College's comprehensive analysis concludes, Midway's 11 minutes remain the gold standard for decisive military action in the industrial age. Never before in recorded history, and never since, has such a brief window of time so completely and irreversibly reversed strategic reality between major powers. Economic historians have calculated that those 11 minutes cost Japan approximately 2 billion yen measured in 1942 values, representing roughly 15% of Japan's entire annual military budget. But the indirect costs were far greater and more devastating. Pilot training programs were dramatically accelerated to replace losses, inevitably reducing quality and effectiveness. Vital resources were diverted from other critical projects to replace the lost carriers. Industrial capacity was strained beyond sustainable limits. The term Midway Syndrome actually entered Japanese business vocabulary decades later, describing situations of dangerous overconfidence leading to catastrophic failure. Japanese Admiral Tanaka Reizo, writing extensively after the war in his memoirs, observed with brutal honesty, "Those 11 minutes taught Japan a lesson that we should have learned earlier. The age of the samurai warrior was definitively over. Individual courage, superior skill, and absolute dedication meant precisely nothing when facing systematic intelligence, overwhelming industrial production, and clear technological superiority. We entered those 11 minutes as proud warriors. We emerged as historical anachronisms. Survivors from both sides carried unique and heavy psychological burdens for the remainder of their lives. American dive bomber pilots who had personally delivered death to thousands in those 11 minutes often suffered debilitating survivor's guilt. Japanese sailors who lived through the catastrophic inferno faced deep shame in their culture for surviving when their ships and shipmates died. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose perfectly placed bomb destroyed the Akagi, never flew combat again due to tuberculosis that was activated by breathing caustic soda fumes from his aircraft's malfunctioning oxygen system during the battle. He spent decades afterward wondering about the specific men he had killed with that single bomb. "I did my duty as a military officer," he said in a 1995 interview. "But duty doesn't ease the knowledge that my professional success meant horrific death for hundreds of men who were also simply doing their duty." Modern computer simulations have recreated those 11 minutes with remarkable precision, revealing just how narrow the margin actually was between total American victory and potential Japanese success. If the American dive bombers had arrived merely 5 minutes later, Japanese combat air patrol would have been refueled and positioned at altitude to intercept. If they had arrived 10 minutes earlier, Japanese flight decks wouldn't have been completely full of vulnerable aircraft. If cloud cover had been 500 feet lower, the dive bombers couldn't have executed their attacks at all. If wind direction had been different by just a few degrees, carriers couldn't have launched or recovered aircraft properly. The simulation conclusion is stark. Those 11 minutes represented literally the only window in a 2-hour period when the Japanese carriers were catastrophically vulnerable to dive bomber attack. The Americans hit that precise window with what can only be described as perfect timing achieved through a combination of skill, intuition, and extraordinary luck. Military doctrine worldwide changed fundamentally based on the lessons of those 11 minutes. Carriers began operating in deliberately dispersed formations rather than concentrated groups. Combat air patrols maintained multiple altitude layers continuously rather than responding to specific threats. Deckload strikes became standard operating procedure, minimizing vulnerable hangar exposure. Damage control became recognized as equally important as offensive capability. Intelligence gathering received equal priority with actual operations. The United States Navy completely rewrote its carrier warfare manual based exclusively on Midway's lessons. The Japanese Navy, tragically, couldn't afford to properly implement the changes their own analysis recommended. They simply lacked the resources to maintain constant air patrol or achieve rapid rearmament capability under combat conditions. Ultimately, those 11 minutes came down to individual human decisions made under extraordinary pressure by men who couldn't possibly have known the full consequences of their choices. McCluskey's decision to follow the destroyer, Best's split-second choice of specific targets while diving, Nagumo's fateful order to rearm for land attack, Spruance's calculated risk to launch at absolute maximum range, individual pilots pressing attacks despite facing certain death. Admiral Spruance reflected years later in his personal papers. "We won Midway because our mistakes proved recoverable while theirs were not." In those 11 minutes, every Japanese mistake was magnified and compounded. Every American gamble paid off against the odds. It wasn't divine justice or manifest destiny. It was simply probability finally catching up with accumulated risk. At the 75th anniversary of Midway in 2017, the last surviving participants from both nations spoke at the official commemoration ceremony. Their words captured the enormous weight of what happened and how it shaped the rest of the 20th century. History remembers those 11 minutes as simultaneously glorious achievement and necessary horror. They defined not just a single battle, but an entire era in human history, proving conclusively that in modern warfare, advantage can shift instantly and irreversibly. They demonstrated that intelligence, technology, and industrial capacity matter fundamentally more than tradition, intensive training, and tactical superiority. They showed that individual decisions made at crucial moments can outweigh years of careful preparation and planning. Between 10:20 and 10:31 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the entire trajectory of human history shifted beneath the Pacific sun. 3 Japanese carriers, representing the pride of the Imperial Navy, the primary instruments of Pacific conquest and the symbols of Japanese military power, were transformed into burning wrecks that would soon slip beneath the waves. The American pilots, who had been routinely dismissed as inferior, discovered they could utterly destroy the world's most experienced naval force when circumstances aligned properly. The Japanese pilots, who had ruled Pacific skies for 6 months, discovered in 11 terrible minutes that their dominance had been an illusion built on temporary advantage rather than permanent superiority. In those 11 minutes, 2,181 Japanese sailors and airmen would eventually die aboard or near the 4 carriers, joining 307 Americans who had died in the torpedo attacks that preceded the dive bomber strikes, all of them together transforming abstract strategic concepts into concrete human tragedy. Their sacrifice, both willing and unwilling, both victorious and defeated, created the precise pivot point around which the entire Pacific War turned from Japanese advance to American counteroffensive. The carriers that sank beneath the Pacific took with them not just steel, fuel, and ammunition, but also dreams of empire, assumptions of racial and cultural superiority, and confidence in predetermined destiny. They left behind thousands of widows who would never know precisely how their husbands died, children who would grow up without fathers and with only vague memories or photographs, and 2 nations forced to confront the fundamental difference between comforting mythology and harsh reality. Today, the Pacific Ocean flows peacefully over the graves of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Yorktown rests in the depths nearby, American and Japanese wrecks sharing the same dark waters far below the surface, where sunlight never penetrates. They remain there as eternal monuments to those 11 minutes when the future was forged in falling bombs and rising flames, when young men from both nations died for causes they believed in with absolute conviction, and when the modern world was born in violence that seemed, in that moment, to be the ending of everything, but proved instead to be a crucial beginning. Those 11 minutes changed far more than just the Pacific War's trajectory. They fundamentally changed how humanity would fight wars, think about conflict, and remember sacrifice. In those 11 minutes, the age of the individual warrior ended decisively, and the age of the systems technologist began irreversibly. The world has never been the same since those bombs fell, and perhaps it never will be.